from Kurtco Media.
So what you gonna do about it?
More strange days. Our incumbent president insists that our voting process is a disaster, that the results won't be legitimate, and Americans cannot trust the outcome of the election in November. That's, of course, if he loses. If he wins, he'll call it a perfect election. In particular, he's attacked mail-in balloting, especially where states concerned with COVID are sending out ballots to all registered voters. Never before in our lifetime has any president attacked the validity of our voting system and worked so hard to create doubt and distrust for the democratic process that we hold so dear. Is it possible that there's some truth to what our president is claiming? Do we understand, and are we prepared for the likely mess that November will bring? What can each of us do to prepare and optimize the likelihood for a peaceful end to this crazy year? We're at ground zero, so today we're asking one of the world's greatest election experts to set us straight. This is Politics. Meet me in the middle. I'm Bill Curtis. Let's meet our panel. First, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, best-selling author, a prolific lecturer, and a beloved professor at Pepperdine University, Ed Larson. Nice to see you zoomed in, Ed.
Nice to see you as well, Bill, and welcome, Robin.
Thank you.
Also zooming in, Jane Albrecht. She's an international trade attorney who's fought for U.S. economic and business interests to high-level government officials all over the world. She's a dedicated political activist, and she's participated on numerous presidential campaigns. Hi, Jane. Nice to remotely see you, too.
Nice to see you too, and welcome indeed, Robin.
Well, our special guest, as you've heard, Robin Carnahan. She is the former Secretary of State of Missouri, and as Secretary of State, one of her primary functions was ensuring that elections were fair. She's known for having modernized and improved Missouri's election systems by implementing its first statewide voter registration system. She created the Missouri Voting Rights Center, and she launched a new interactive election results website. But she's also served as co-chair of the Elections Committee for Bipartisan National Associations of Secretary of State. Since her tenure as Secretary of State, in her role with the Democratic National Institute, Robin served in countries all over the world, monitoring elections, training political leaders, and drafting voting laws. Welcome, Robin Carnahan. Good of you to join us.
It's great to be here, Bill.
So, Ed, I hope you don't mind if we just start with you. How did the position of a state Secretary of State get created in American political structures?
It's actually as old as the Republic. Right when the states declared their independence in 1776, they began drafting new constitutions, their first written constitutions. And most of them began with creating an office that became the Secretary of State. Now, it should not be confused with the U.S. Federal Secretary of State, which is an overseas job, sort of the foreign minister. This is was created as a functionary job to keep the state seal, to register documents, to issue notary republic certificates eventually, to handle the documents of elections and other processes like this. Some of them issue blue books, some register lobbyists, and it has changed over the years. In some places it's grown, in some places it's shrunk. I know in Wisconsin it's virtually disappeared. It depends, and in some places it's elected. Most places I probably still elected. In some places it's appointed, like in Virginia, part of the governor's cabinet. Sometimes it runs independently, but it's a job, and it'll differ from state to state, but it's a job that handles, conceptually, it was originally designed as handling the paperwork for the state. Often it will issue corporate documents as well, but again, it varies from state to state.
So, Robin, I wonder if you could tell us, what is a state Secretary of State's function when it comes to elections?
So Ed's right. The original job of Secretary of State was very much administrative. If you think back to the time of kings, where you had to have a seal to show that something was an official document, the original secretaries were always the keepers of the Great Seal, which showed these were official documents or actions of the government. And so that continues to be an important role in offices. And over time, in many states, as Ed said, the Secretary of State is the chief elections officer of the state. And it's sort of a strange reference because as you know, in our system, elections are all completely run locally. So no Secretary of State ever touches a ballot or prints a ballot or counts a ballot. But they do set policies, and they are the sort of conduit for federal money and state money that flows down to counties or local election jurisdictions.
But you have since that time gotten so involved in election processes, both domestically and abroad. Um, Tell me, was there ever in American history a time where a candidate attempted to invalidate an election prior to election day?
Well, that sounds like more of a question for Ed the historian than it does for me. But I will say, in my memory, no. I have been involved in elections for much of my life. I've been on the ballot 10 times as a candidate. I've overseen a lot of elections in my state. I've observed elections in 20 different countries, and there's no doubt that we're at a very unusual time where we have a candidate who is sowing doubt about the process, and that's not been something that's happened typically in America.
Ed, has this ever happened before, at least in the U.S.?
Oh, sure. There are many times when a candidate has predicted disasters and warned of disasters in coming elections. Probably the most famous was 1876, when, the Republicans feared enormous voter suppression of African Americans in the South during Reconstruction. So sure, and there were worries during wars. There have been a lot of times where there's been worried. Now, local level, I assume it comes up at the local level. There have been a lot of accusations of fraudulent state legislative elections and state elections in a variety of states. I'm sure Robin served as a Secretary of State next door to notorious Illinois, and she probably has endless stories about Illinois elections.
Well, look, I mean, there's always a lot of speculation around elections. Anytime that you have, 150 million Americans doing the same thing at the same time, with essentially volunteers running the process. I mean, even in the best of times, elections are pretty miraculous because of all the logistics that it takes to pull them off. But certainly now, with the threats are not just one-off threats. They're more systemic, and that's what makes it troubling.
So our last question about the past, which I'll start again with Ed. Ed, when did election results shift from taking months to count to an expected election day outcome?
Oh, for all practical purposes, it came with the electronic transmission of results, which would come with the telegraph. Before that, it would take a long time for the results. I know that in 1800, John Adams went to bed thinking he'd won the election over Jefferson, and of course he hadn't. But he didn't know what South Carolina had done and Pennsylvania and the other states. But once you had the electronic transfer of results, it happened pretty quick because remember, ballot elections used to take place in person. There was no ballots to count. People just went down and dropped the ball in a bucket or made their announcement, and so people on the spot knew exactly how the results had come out there, and it just took time to, as soon as it just had to communicate it. And once you had telegraphs that communicate it, elections very quickly became the biggest news there was in America. People followed those closely. So, news went around pretty quick. I know that in that notorious election of 1876 that I mentioned earlier, the Republicans knew how many votes they had to steal that very night.
Interesting. But we survived those moments where there was uh, doubt injected into the election process.
Uh, I don't know what you mean by survive. I mean, that was a disaster of an election. You had Rutherford be fraudulently be Rutherford, or whatever they used to nickname him, and Samuel Tilden taken away from an election. But the country muddled through with a great sense that this last election in 1876 had been a total fraud, and they didn't try running Hayes again. They learned that much.
Interesting. So by that, I could read into you expect us to muddle our way through this year as well.
I'm not making any predictions, Bill. No predictions at all.
I tried. Robin, let's talk a little about the voting process, how it works. How does a state count our votes and certify an election?
Well, the first thing to remember is that every state does its own thing. So there are really very few federal rules about elections. Those are generally left to the states, and the process of running the elections, as I said, is left to very local folks at the county level, and some places in the country even at the town level. So traditionally, that's been people showing up in person on election day. Over time, and by the way, the history of elections being on a Tuesday, do you know why that happens? Why we vote on a Tuesday in November?
No, I don't know.
Okay, this is really interesting to me because I'm an elections geek. Ed, do you know the history of this? Well, I'm going to tell you.
I think you've got
Okay,
it all over a barrel.
all right. So here's the reason. At least this is what I understand. That they wanted to have it in November because that was not the winter in most of the country, that it was not planting season, it was not growing and harvest season. So it was sort of a convenient time for folks who very much lived in a rural economy to be able to like set aside some time to do something. It usually could take a day or so to get into town, to the county seat where you would have to gather to go vote. So you didn't want to, of course, you weren't going to make people travel on a Sunday because that was church day, and you didn't want it to be on Monday because you might have travel on Sunday, and Wednesday was traditionally market day. So it was convenient for people to come into town on Tuesday and vote and then be there for market day on Wednesday. So I always find it fascinating that we set this up originally a Tuesday in November because it was convenient for people to vote on a Tuesday in November. And yet we've continued to make it a Tuesday in November when it's not at all convenient for people anymore. So that's just a little sidebar history note. But the role that, the way the elections process works is generally you show up on election day. If you think about it as a business, it would be as if you had all of your customers that could show up on the same day, even though you know they're not going to, but you have to be prepared in case they do. Your frontline workers to interact with those customers are essentially volunteers. Average age, they get paid maybe $100 for a 16-hour day.
Why is that? Why don't we have government employees?
Just historically, this has been a thing we've used the community to do, and you have to have dedicated Democratic officials and Republican officials there to watch the process. And so they've not made county or city employees make those declarations to become partisans in the process.
But that sounds like it works that way because it's always worked that way.
But I think it's good to have partisans in the process, by the way.
Of course, but what about the idea of having federal or state employees as part of the process? Because right now, if I understand correctly, it's really a nightmare finding enough volunteers to manage an election properly.
But isn't that because of COVID, Ed? Isn't the difficulty this year because of COVID?
Yes.
Yeah.
That is the average age is 72 of poll workers, right? And I can go into a bunch of detail about why it's difficult.
Of presidential candidates, I think, is higher than that.
It is, turns out this year. But so anyway, as Jane said, this year, obviously people who are at a high risk for COVID are not interested in spending 16 hours in a room with a bunch of other people. So lots more new poll workers are being brought into the process. And that requires extra training, right? So everybody has to go through training to figure out what the rules are. And so that's a challenge. And then voters, when they show up, they want to like be in and out in 10 minutes, right? They don't want to have to wait in line. And then they want the results, and they want it all to be perfect. And when they leave, they want the results to be, out there in 30 minutes after election day, or after the polls close. So
Okay.
the expectations that voters have about this process are pretty unrealistic for something we don't invest very much money in. So that's number one thing I would say. But number two, COVID has put this giant stress on what's already a pretty stressed system by changing voting habits. So now all of a sudden, in states, unlike in California, where a lot of folks can vote by mail, and that's been a thing that's been happening for a long time. In my home state of Missouri, you always had to have an excuse to vote not in person on election day. And if you wanted to do that, you had to get your ballot notarized if you weren't going to show up in person on election day. And so a lot of states are like that and are changing because people want to be safe and vote to want to vote by mail. And so there's been like 5,000% increases in demand for vote by mail in places that haven't done it. So that's an added stress on the system. So yeah, lots of stresses this year.
Robin, how many states? I mean, I don't expect you to know everything in every 50 states, but based on your prior experience, what's your gut feeling of these states where there's this huge increase of mail-in ballots? How many states are going to really be overwhelmed by this? A lot, a few?
Well, I don't know how many are going to be overwhelmed, but an awful lot of states are dealing with exponentially higher numbers of mail-in ballots. And those are states that haven't done this before. And it's very different. The process for keeping track of those mail ballots and processing those is really different than it is if you just walk in and if you walk in person, you proved who you are. And all you got to do is like cast your ballot. There's no more, the sort of proofing of the ballot and the voter is happening right then and there. If it's a mail-in ballot, you have to like check a signature, right? It's on the outside of an envelope that says this is the voter. And so you've got to go find the voter's file. And that takes some time, and you got to check it against what's there. And these people aren't signature experts. And then you got to make sure everything else is right. And then you got to open all these envelopes, and then you process the ballot. So it's just a time-consuming process.
Is it reasonable, though, to ask people to have a notary, at least in this time where look, we're in a different time than usual. We have a pandemic running around the country, and many people, especially the more at risk and older people, don't necessarily feel safe standing on a line and casting their vote on election day. So what prevents us from having an exception here and having another way? I mean, I was shocked to find out that on Monday the Supreme Court granted a request from the Republicans in South Carolina to reinstate the state's witness signature requirement on absentee ballots. How do you do that in a time where you don't want to see other people, at least not in person?
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think it's completely unreasonable to put some of these requirements on at a time of a global pandemic. And yet, it doesn't matter that I think that's unreasonable because that's state law and states run elections. And so what is important right now is that there be clarity on what the rules are around the election, so voters know what to do, so election officials know what to do, and so we can get going with this process. And to me, the troubling thing about these lawsuits at the moment is that they're just so close to the election that it causes confusion for voters as well as election officials and folks who have to carry this out.
So if I may, um, I'd like to read a list of 8 states for no particular reason and ask you how secure you feel their election process is, and if they're going to be prepared to deal with the stress of mail-in ballots. Wisconsin, Florida, Minnesota, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona, for no particular reason, other than those are pretty much the states that are going to make or break this election for one of the other parties, I believe. So are those states, let's start with Wisconsin, Florida, and Minnesota, are those states prepared for this unique election that we're about to have?
I certainly hope so. I don't pretend to have a crystal ball about all the preparations that those states have made, but all of this comes down to sort of the ability of these election officials to do their job. And that's been hard this year. It's hard because even they want to do the right things. It's hard because the rules are changing. It's hard because the way people want to vote are changing, and it's hard because of all the political rhetoric around what's happening with elections and sort of undermining people's confidence in what they do. So I generally have a lot of faith in election officials wanting to do the right thing. Obviously, there are exceptions, but in general, I think they really do. And I want to give them the latitude and help that they need to get it done right.
So, congratulations. You've just been reelected as Secretary of State of, oh, let's pick Wisconsin. What are you going to do to try to ensure that this election is beyond reproach?
So I think elections are about a couple of things. But anytime elections are sort of a miracle, as I said, but you have to agree on the rules. And so the first thing I would want to do is have a lot of clarity with all the folks who are running the elections about what the rules and the process are. And I would want to make sure they had whatever they needed to effectively administer that. And whether that's extra PPE, whether that's extra, staff that know how to do technology on their teams, whether it's helping with media and communicating about when results are going to come in. All of those things are things I would be focused on to try to just give them support. One of the things that a lot of states are thinking about right now is how to change their election reporting sites that they've had for all these years. The parlance in secretaries of state and election officials has always been election night reporting, right? That you go as a voter, or you go as a press outlet to the website for the election night results. Well, guess what? We don't have an election day anymore, and we don't have an election night result anymore. And the reason for that is people aren't just voting on election day; they're voting weeks in advance of election day. So this is an election season, and those votes can be counted past election day if they're postmarked on election day, generally in most states. Now, states' rules are different about when you can begin to process ballots, but it's 100% certain they're not going to all be counted on election night. And in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, states you mentioned in particular, they are not by law allowed to begin to process those until election day. And if you have millions of ballots that are coming in by mail and can't even start opening them until election day, for sure you're not going to get them all.
How long does it take? Normally the Secretary of State's office certifies the vote in the end, do they not?
Correct, but
And
that
then
is
how
weeks.
long does
That
it
is
take?
weeks after the certification by the Secretary of State is weeks after the election. But the counties, which are the jurisdictions that run the election, they have what's called a canvass, and those generally happen at various times. I was on with an election official recently, I think maybe in Wisconsin, who said that the 9th was the day of the canvass in Wisconsin. So that they had until the 9th to get all their votes counted. And so that's a week after election day.
Right. So generally then by about a week after election day, most states will know who won in a confident way.
Generally, but there are some states that give you more time. California in particular, I think,
Yeah.
has, I don't know the exact date, but I think it's 2 weeks maybe.
Yeah.
If a ballot is postmarked on election day but doesn't arrive until 2 weeks later, they still count it.
So,
Right.
in your role on the National Association of Secretaries of State, as co-chair, um, what would you recommend to secretaries of state as far as their reporting, and where you have some that won't even start counting mail-in ballots until election day? Do you have any advice for them, and perhaps adjusting their perspective on their process?
Well, look, they don't need my advice. These are folks who are thinking about this and have been thinking about this for many, many months and have teams of people to do it. So I've got a lot of respect for folks that are in these jobs. But the thing I think is important is that we not only do what traditionally has happened, which is, give the red map or the blue map or the pie chart that has slices for whatever candidate. Um, but we need to have one of those slices be ballots that haven't been counted yet, right? So if you have some slice for the Democratic candidate, a slice for an independent, a slice for the Republican, the biggest slice may yet be in some of these places not yet counted ballots on election night. And so that, I think, is the important new way to talk about how the results are not going to be final on election night, because there are lots of ballots yet to be counted.
So, Jane, let me put you on the spot, if I may.
Hmm.
Um, doesn't Trump sort of have a fair point here? You hear stories about states sending out mail in ballots to every registered voter, including dead people, people who've moved, duplicates. Why don't states do more to ensure that their voting records are up to date? Why do you suppose we're kind of back in the dark ages?
I think that's a great question for Robin. I mean, if Trump's complaint is that when you're sending out mail-in ballots to everyone, that's different than when someone requests an absentee ballot. And so a lot of states, including California sometimes, don't keep their voting registries up to date. How widespread is that, and what would it take to fix it? In other words, if you're
And I
sending
just,
ballots out to everyone, and they still have, for example, in our house, my stepdaughter's ballot kept coming for 17 years after she had lived on her own. So how do you control for that?
well, that's a great question. And this is sort of a dilemma of anybody who keeps a list of anything, right?
Hmm.
Particularly on a digital list of anything that they get out
Yeah.
of date. And there are lots of ways states try to keep their lists up to date. Um, and they do that regularly, and by federal law are required to do that. And to send mail and make sure that folks still live in that address. There's also a consortium of states that has, I think, more than 30 involved with a cross-state matching system where you can deduplicate your voter lists. But lists are notoriously hard. People die, people move, and I mean, I would ask those on this call. Anytime you've moved, has one of the items on your checklist been call the former election official where you used to live to tell them that you moved and to take your name off the list? I would submit that no one has done that, because why would you? Like, no one does that.
But then again,
So,
let's talk about a process for a minute, Robin, because it in this day and age, while you can do your banking online and keep track of the flow of money, and security is high, and it is incredibly specific and 3, 4, 5 times checked over. Why is it that a deduping process can't occur after the vote to make sure that A, people haven't voted twice, B, someone who has voted is still alive, and wouldn't you eliminate through a deduping process 99% of the problem that could occur from a database that we're talking about, the database problem we're talking about?
all right. So I've got a whole bunch of reactions to what you just said there, because that was outlandish. Number one, uh, the banking system has billions of dollars invested in it, and the election system not much. So that's number one. Number two, uh, there are there are some accounts of election fraud, but not very many in the grand scheme of things. And the actual occurrence of people voting more than once or a dead person voting is like completely remote and the thing of fiction in most cases. So do dead people have ballots that sometimes are sent to their homes because the list hasn't been updated with Social Security death records? Of course. Do sometimes dead people's names still occur on these lists, a voter list? Of course, it happens. But there's no evidence of a dead person voting. There's just none. Dead people don't get out of the grave and vote. people don't go and vote more than once. And so the deduping process doesn't have to happen after the fact. It happens before the fact. And Jane, in your instance, you know, your daughter-in-law could have, if she knew for 17 years that this was being sent, she could have called and said, take me off that list.
On
Had you voted that, it would have been a felony, right?
Oh,
So
that's a good thing to know.
most people don't want to risk going to jail to vote twice. Like, I think elections and voting is really important, but most people think feeding their family is important. If they're going to break a law, they're going to choose a different one to break than election fraud.
I'm not sure many people know it's a felony. That's a good thing to know.
But we're now 2 months into our election process being second guessed by the current sitting president. And so that means we have to react differently than we would normally react. And all I'm suggesting is if there is doubt in the process of sending out too many ballots to too many people to addresses where they no longer live, or maybe they're no longer living, then an easy way to solve the issue would be a deduping process after the election, which has got to be almost instantaneous as you scan and upload someone's vote if it's paper, or you have someone voting by machine, or you've counted their ballot. I can't understand why there isn't more of an overwhelming solution to a ridiculous accusation of
So this is totally not a technology problem. Like, you're 100% correct that there are lots of ways you could have technology used to fix all of this. That takes money and it takes an investment, and we haven't made it as Americans. And so we're getting through this process as best we can with lots of rules changing and not much money invested in the process. So are there improvements? Heck yeah. Am I for them? Absolutely. And I'm hoping that after this election, we'll be able to come to some consensus as a country to have some more standardization in some of these rules. Like, frankly, if you ask me, it's completely unfair that some people get to easily vote at home and have a ballot mailed to them, and other people have to have an excuse and a notary and show up in person in order to vote. To me, that is an equal protection big difference, and should be challenged under equal protection provisions. But
Oh, that would
like,
be interesting.
that is a broader question about access to the ballot than we're having right now.
I understand that there have been a lot of bills introduced to Congress that would have provided money to the states to upgrade their voting systems. Most of those were actually uh, put up by the Democrats, I understand. But none, did any of them ever pass? And if not, why not?
Oh yeah. So I think they passed a $400 million bill this spring, and they had another significant chunk either last year or the year before. The problem is a lot of that was a little bit too. It's a little too little and a little too late. Um, there are only a few folks who make election voting machines. There's not a giant market for this. It's very specific. And I have lots of thoughts about that, but you need to have some advance warning. And that's not a thing that you can just flip the switch on, in 2 or 3 months and have everybody up to speed with new machines and everybody trained on how to use those. Elections only happen, every, maybe a couple of times a year at best. And so that's why this is a challenge, is because we only do this every now and then, and we keep changing the way we do it. And so keeping up with that is expensive. Everybody thought after Bush v. Gore in 2000, when the famous hanging chads, were the problem, and got rid of all of those types of what were called punch card ballots. And I remember at the time thinking, this is insane to get rid of all of these punch card ballots, because this is a very low tech, easy to count, easy to use, cheap way to vote. And the problem with that, there were 2 problems with those specifically. Is one, the main fault of these punch cards is that if you don't, just like your hole puncher, when you make punches in your to make holes in a piece of paper, if you don't clean out the trash, you can't punch a hole, right? So like, they didn't clean out the trash, so you couldn't punch a hole. So that was number one. That was a hanging chad, and why that happened. and the other was the design of the ballot, where they messed up that and didn't have them well connected. So like the solutions to those old punch card machines were super easy. And yet what happened in Washington was like they blamed those things, not the human error that caused this, that you could fix relatively cheaply, and threw a whole bunch of money at new machines, all of which are now 15 or 20 years old and need to be replaced. So that's many more billions of dollars that are going to be needed to invest in technology to run elections going forward. So
Robin, is there
sorry
generally
about that little history
No, that's
lesson, but
great.
that's always gotten under my skin because it was a mistake at the time that could have been fixed in a much cheaper and better way.
I've never heard that before, although I've seen that happen in other areas. Um, is the problem? I remember with the hanging chads in Florida, I was surprised at the time that most of the states didn't have more modern technology. Is the problem that the states generally don't have the money or don't want to spend the money on new technology for voting, and therefore they always need help from the federal government? I mean, where is the problem with the funding? Is it state and federal, state or federal?
Yeah, states don't tend to spend money on this because they have limited budgets. And so then you have to decide, like, is this just a state problem or is this a national problem? And every now and then the Congress decides it's a national problem if it gets big and bad enough, and they throw some money at it. But it wasn't until the Bush v. Gore, hanging Chad thing in Florida that it got enough attention to say this is a national problem that needs a national response. And then again after 2016, when there was threats of hacking of foreign actors into our election system, that they then provided federal money and support from Homeland Security and others to do cyber security protections for election officials. So when the crisis is big enough, the feds usually step in with money.
So there's been money spent now, and in the future we'll see more new machines, but just not for this election.
So the money's not been spent very much on machines. It's been spent more recently for cybersecurity efforts.
Have there been any cases where the security of at least the computer and software process of counting votes from machines has been compromised that we've known of?
So I don't know that myself. Look, but what I know is that the voting machines are not connected to the internet in any state, and that's good, right? Because it's only things that are connected to the internet that have the ability to be easily hacked.
How do they communicate then?
Pardon?
How do they communicate their results?
So that's not the vote. That's not the actual voting machines. That is the election reporting sites, and that is a thing that goes on the internet. And so I think that there is a lot of effort being made right now to make sure those are robust and as secure as possible. But just remember, even if things change, even if God forbid, somebody messed with the results in one of these states that was just reported, that doesn't change a vote, right? And every state goes back and they do audits and they double check and triple check before they certify the actual results of the election. So just because something looks funky on election night or the next day doesn't mean that's the end of it. There are backstops and belts and suspenders for all of these things, and that's what we need to keep in mind.
Jane, we're going to take a quick
Okay.
break. We're here with Robin Carnahan, Ed Larson, and Jane Albrecht. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back with Robin Carnahan, Ed Larson, and Jane Albrecht. And Jane, you had a question.
Robin, if the situation arose that that someone got a ballot for someone that didn't live in their home anymore, and that person had moved out of state, so that person votes in New York, and we live here in California, and that person's ballot gets voted in California, would either Secretary of State have a chance of figuring that out, or it's might go under the radar?
Well, I'm not sure. Are you suggesting that that person flew from California to cast their vote, and then they flew to New York and cast a vote in New York?
No, someone was willing to improperly fill out a ballot that came to their house but wasn't theirs. and
Okay,
that person now
and
lives
then
in
for
another.
yeah, and then forged their signature, and then that forged signature got through the signature check that the
Okay.
Secretary of State
So
does
first of all,
before.
they've got to know they really are. So signatures really are checked in every state. Is
Yes,
this okay? That's okay. So it would you'd have to be able to forge a signature, not just file a second ballot.
correct.
Okay. And it's a
So, I
felony.
mean, by the way, like that, when I was Secretary of State, the election offenses that we saw would be things like someone voting in both Kansas and Missouri,
Mhm.
right? Where, and maybe it was an election, a local election, and they were like, oh, well, we just voted for the sheriff in this county because, like, but I voted for the president over there. Like, what they were thinking, I don't know, but it never struck me as like really rampant voter fraud. It was a confused voter. But yes, in your case, it would either take the voter flying across the country to like vote both ballots, if they wanted to do that, or somebody forging someone's signature.
Right. Okay. I didn't know that that every state actually checks it against a
Yes.
signature.
That's
In
good to know. So I
yeah.
wonder, Robin, if we can get on to this November election. We're in a place where the incumbent has damaged our faith in the process, of course, unless he wins. What will the secretaries of state do if their state elects one candidate, but the incumbent denies its validity, basically slapping the secretary of state in the face? How will they react to that?
I can only tell you how I would react to that and how I think that my former colleagues would react, and that is that they were elected by the citizens of their state to do a job, one of which is to oversee the elections, and so that's who they answer to. And I would expect them to stand up for the results that their county officials have provided to them. So, I can't anticipate what all these circumstances are, but they're doing their job, and if they feel like they've done it well, I can't imagine that they wouldn't publicly say that.
When they do the audits and the counts, is it the Secretary of State that does that, or is it all the counties that recount?
So that varies from state to state, but in general, those are done by the counties because they're the ones who handle the ballots. The ballots are never moved into the physical custody of the Secretary of State's office. Those always remain local.
So
Interesting.
I'm going to ask all of you this, but start with Ed because I know how much he likes talking about the future. Ed, if you were in charge of this election and you wanted to make this election most impervious to doubt and objection by the loser, what would you enact?
Well, if you're talking about the two candidates we're dealing with here, I don't anticipate former Vice President Biden raising questions. And when I think about President Trump, I don't know what he believes. And so he may truly believe, because of all the things that Robin said, he may truly believe there is a problem with mail-in voting. And if he truly believes that, he may just be saying it so he keep office. But he may truly believe it, and if he truly believes it, well, he should do something.
Well, but I'm curious, why does he believe that the problems would result in Biden becoming elected as opposed to the problems resulting in him getting elected? Why is all the corruption supposedly on one side?
Now you're asking me to be a psychologist and psychoanalyze President Trump, and now that's way beyond my ability. I don't know how he thinks. I really can't, and I can't. But I do think I know people who 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 feel victimized in their very nature, and they see things through the lens of a victim, and that could be the case.
Interesting. Jane, what do you think? What would you do to this election to try to make it most impervious to objection?
I think first and foremost, you have to get out really solid information of the kind that Robin's providing today. I think public education is going to be really important. Um, and and then have as solid an election process and day as you could. If I was a state official, it's not within the Secretary of State's power. But if I were a governor or I was a mayor or whoever, I would have true protection at as many poll stations as I could. Not intimidation, but just protection to be sure things are safe and calm there.
How do you feel about that, Robin?
So this is a really delicate thing, right? Because some people see the police as protectors, and some see the police as not protectors, and so that is a delicate thing. In most states, there are very clear rules about who can and cannot come into an election polling place. That there are official sort of watchers or people delegated by the parties to be there, and they're allowed, and other people are not allowed. And the whole idea is to prevent disruption on election day. So I think having people sort of ready to go if needed is important, but I don't think we should have intimidation on either side.
I agree. I think it is a delicate question, and I think that's a good idea, is have people ready to go if there are people at the polls intimidating, to try to get them away.
Because
It's
that's
tough.
against the law,
Yeah.
right? Because at that point you're enforcing the law.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, far be it from me to have an opinion on this show, but I can't help it. I don't think that it's about the security of the voting process, the professionalism of the voting process. I think that this vote will be, the results of this vote will be objected to in the event that the vote goes a certain way, and that it's really not subject to how secure and how professional and how specific we are. But Robin, I understand it's expected that more Republicans are going to vote by machine counted on election day, and more Democrats will vote by mail. Substantially more Democrats will be voting by mail. And those are going to be counted in the days and the weeks subsequent to the election, right?
All right. So
So,
you
so
said two things. You said two things, and I'll try to address both of those. One is that
I
there's a
just want to make clear what my question is. So election night may be misleading until the mail-in ballots are counted, correct?
well, that's for sure. So that was the second part of your question. The first was the presumption that more of one Democrats are going to vote in person and more Republicans are going to vote by mail.
Polls are
Right. So I don't know that that's true, and I think people's preferences are changing all the time. So I think that we can't count on any of that being accurate come election day. People change their minds, and they can. As for the results on election night, I 100% do not think we will have final results on election night. And let me go back again, and I'll say in part because we know that Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, two important swing states that are close, can't even start processing vote by mail ballots until election day. There are going to be millions of ballots to process, and they are not going to get through those all on election night. So I just think that we can predict that this is going to be, unless it is a blowout one way or another, I think that we should not expect to have final results on election night.
So what you're saying is that we could get to the end of election night, and the media pundits, they're going to be busy reporting on every nuance, every lead, every,
Right.
there's 1% of the vote in, and they're trying to project who's going to win. What advice do you have for our listeners to be prepared for a complex election day and a frustrating election week and potentially the months after?
So you only can control the things you can control. So I always encourage voters who want to know what they can do to just either vote early in person or vote their mail ballot and get it back early. For states where you can start processing those ballots before election day, which is most of them, it just makes it easier on election officials. So the
let's
sooner
say
you can, the sooner you can vote, the sooner you can vote and just be out of the process, the easier it is on election officials who have a lot of pressure come election day. So
for
that's the
example,
number one thing.
your vote counted and reported on election day. Um, uh, it's a good
Vote,
idea
vote
to, if
early.
you're going to vote by mail, vote early, vote now.
And if you're going to vote in person, if you have a chance to do it before election day, do that too.
But as you pointed out, that varies by state. There are states that they
Everything.
won't account if you, even if you vote early, they won't count your ballot until election day. There are some states. There are other states that will count your ballot when it comes in. And you can see that if you're watching on election night, because in some states, as soon as the polls close, there's an explosion of number of votes. Those are the states where they've already counted them. In other states where they don't do that, that's where you get this long red shift or blue shift happening later. But of course, there's only a red or blue shift if if one members of one party are supporting one person tend to vote by write-in more than the other. And as Robin points out, we don't know that's going to be true. There's a tremendous push by the Democratic Party now to encourage their people to vote live. I am wondering, though, many people are not using mail-in ballots, but they're going to early voting. When you vote early, like the previous Sunday or a week before, 2 weeks before, when you vote in person early, when are those votes counted?
So I can't speak for every state or election jurisdiction, but in my state, those would be treated as absentee ballots, and those could be counted in my state prior to election day, and those would be reported in that first tranche of returns. So we always would refer to those as the midday numbers. So all of the thing that came in before the polls closed would be basically the early votes that either came in by mail or came in person, that could be reported. And that's what you put out as soon as the polls close, because those you've already taken care of. So for states where you can do that, you get a lot of people out of the way early. It just makes it easier on election day. So that's why I think wherever you can, vote early in person. Wherever you can, vote early by mail, but just go ahead and get it over with.
So let's talk about the scenario in which Trump doesn't accept the outcome of the election. And the most likely scenario is if election night looks like he wins, and then subsequently, as mail-in ballots are counted, it shifts and he loses, because then he will say that the fraud occurred in a place that he can identify, which is the mail-in ballots, the counting of the mail-in ballots. That's what we're really afraid of, is that a situation can get created where there is a reason to doubt the validity of the election, which is why we're saying to people, get out and vote now, vote early, make sure that your vote is counted in the first tranche of your state's accounting, right? Is that fair?
Um, Lots of presumptions in that as well, but yeah, it's just everything is easier if it gets done early. So I would be for that. I think that, look, the law requires in these states, every state has a law. This is not a law that's made by Donald Trump or anybody else. It is a law that's made by the states about the rules of what ballots get counted. And for most states, again, it's not all, for most, you have to have a postmark by election day. And then there's some number of days that the mail has to arrive. And those are valid votes that they are by law required to count. They can't choose to not count them, because by law they're required to count them. So that's what election officials are going to do, regardless of what candidates claim. The election officials are going to count the votes, and that's what they should do. And then it's going to be up to the media and everybody else to figure out how they're going to react to those counts. But they're not going to count votes that they shouldn't count. They're only going to count the ones they should. That it may end up going to court. My prediction would be that in some of these states, there will be court cases to try to stop counts or to start counts or to do whatever. And that's going to be a mess and really confusing. And so we just need to be prepared for that. And if one of the ways we can prepare for that is to vote early, then that's what folks should do.
So,
But under what circumstances could a state legislature, if a Secretary of State has certified a vote, under what circumstances could a state legislature say, we're not going to allocate electors based on that, we're going to do our own thing? Would that even be legal?
I would assume that would not be a legal action they could take, but again, I'm not a
Yeah.
I'm a recovering lawyer, but not a
Right.
expert on all of these state laws. Um, but yeah, that would be a pretty abnormal circumstance that I would expect to be a mess and subject to court challenge.
we're going to talk about the various types of court challenges that you may expect in just a minute. We'll be back actually in 30 seconds. Okay, we're back with Robin Carnahan. And Robin, I wonder if you could just tell us a little about where do you think that the likely appeals to a court decision may occur in this election in the event it doesn't go the way that our incumbent president hopes?
Yeah, there are an awful lot of court challenges that have already been filed that I suspect are sort of setting up for the next stage for post-election. We've seen them in South Carolina about witness requirements. We've seen them in North Carolina about how you do ballot curing for any kind of problem with the ballot. We've seen them in Pennsylvania about opening times and when ballots are getting sent to people. So yeah, I think we're going to have a crazy amount of litigation about the election and very sort of specific processes about the elections.
Unless it's a blowout.
Unless it's a blowout. We might have them even if it is a blowout, but it will get less attention if it's a blowout.
Why is it that the assumption is that the Republicans do better if less people vote and the Democrats do better if more people vote? Why is that assumption?
I don't know. That might be a better for the historian in the group than me, because a lot of these assumptions that people make about voting turn out not to have a lot of fact beneath them. And I've never understood why, for example, the photo ID argument exists in the way that it does, because there are a lot of older people who don't have a valid state driver's license that also could be disenfranchised by these requirements. And yet Republicans somehow think it's only poor minority people that don't have these and that they're not going to be their voters. So I know when we had these arguments in Missouri, there were plenty of people who lived in rural areas who might have been thought of as Republican leaning voters who didn't have these IDs. So I think a lot of people's assumptions are not accurate about this stuff. And so the better approach, certainly for an election official, is just to be fair across the board. And that's what I think most of them try to do.
And have we kind of had a history of candidates trying to suppress votes?
Oh my gosh, America has a deep and rich history of voter suppression. It goes back to the beginning of our country, colonial times. You go from colony to colony, and there was systematic vote suppression. You couldn't, of course, Black people couldn't vote, women couldn't vote. Usually you had to own property to vote, and in some states, considerable amount of property. Immigrants couldn't vote in many places. And then when we declared our independence and we went to the Constitutional Convention, what the Constitutional Convention did after much debate was institutionalize those state efforts to suppress votes or not suppress votes. They left it to the states. Many people at the Constitutional Convention, led by Ben Franklin, wanted to have, well, it's going to be federal elections for Congress. We should have federal standards. But they didn't, they decided instead to leave it entirely up to the states. So every state was able to perpetuate their particular efforts. I mean, in some states, you had to be a member of the established church to vote in colonial times. And then all that was pushed even further by the electoral college system, because the electoral college system, one of its purposes was to facilitate suppression of votes by states, because you were given a number of votes in the electoral college, not based on how many people voted, but on how many people, whether you allowed them to vote or not, how many people lived in that state. So if you suppress the votes of based on race or based on religion or based on ethnicity or based on immigrant status or based on wealth, or based on whether they were women or not, you still got your full electoral college. So it was intentionally adopted, the electoral college system, as a way to perpetuate or facilitate voter suppression. So, and then you can go through the Jim Crow era, or just go through any period in American history. We have a long history of voter suppression that continues to this day.
And there's a type of suppression that I don't really understand. I can certainly understand why one party or the other would try to suppress a specific people that are very likely going to vote the other party. But for example, in the case, we have a state that is expecting to throw out 100,000 ballots because the voter won't know to put the security envelope around their ballot and supply it in the way that the instructions outline. And for some reason, the Republicans want those ballots to be thrown out. The Democrats are fighting against that. What I don't understand is there a suggestion that there are more Republicans that are highly educated than Democrats that are highly educated and therefore can read and follow instructions? Or what would be the reason behind that kind of clear, in my mind, voter suppression if you just simply forgot the security envelope and didn't read the instructions?
I'll pass this one to Jane because she's a Democratic Party official. I'm just a historian.
Well, I think the general feeling in the Democratic Party is that when more people vote, Democrats tend to win. And in a state, I don't know what state you're talking about offhand. A couple of states.
Pennsylvania.
Was it Pennsylvania?
That's correct, Robin.
But certainly North Carolina, in a state like North Carolina or South Carolina, the general feeling is that the more people turn out, the less wealthy people turn out, the more people of color, the more the Democrats are going to win.
But in this
So
case,
that's where that comes from.
talking about the elimination of people who can't follow directions.
I don't know if the RTFM
Line.
read the effing manual is I think it's equal for all races, colors, and probably economic levels.
Robin, any thoughts here?
I mean, obviously, people think that there are going to be more mistakes made by certain voters than others, and that's why they're trying to do this. I think with those particular rules in Pennsylvania about the envelope, those were originally intended for feels like a pretty legitimate purpose, which is secrecy of the ballot, right? And so the idea was to protect the vote of and the secrecy and the privacy of the voter, but also to prevent anybody messing, like looking at the vote and deciding whether they were going to tear it up or not. So like you can imagine that for security reasons, that it would make some sense to have something like that. But yeah, if really 100,000 votes get tossed out because of it, that seems like the wrong result.
So we've learned a couple of things today. We've learned that if we want to avoid the most confusion and have the lowest risk, by the way, of violence as a result of our election, and actually degrade our reputation as a country further, we can avoid all that if we vote early, if we vote by machine, and if we get every friend that we know and every family member to do the same. And that's probably the most powerful thing that's probably the most powerful message that we can give people in this show.
Robin, before we run out of time, yesterday when we talked, you talked about three things the Secretary of State's job is to give people confidence in the election. Do you remember what those were? It was really,
Yeah, I suspect that I was talking about the first being having clarity of rules, right?
yeah,
So that
yeah.
people understand what the rules of the game are and what their role is in it. The second is to have an effective sort of mechanism of running the election so that they're able to, get voters in and out and process them in ways that are effective and feel like they're fair and protecting the things we care about. And the third is transparency, that all of the process be clear and transparent to outside parties to see that it's being done in an even-handed way. So that's what I think most election officials think about. And the more we can, the earlier we can vote to reduce pressure on election day, the more we can help them achieve those things.
And last question, Robin, before we run. You have served in a number of countries, helping them to run elections in a democratic way, small d. You have put in a tremendous amount of your own personal time and sweat and effort there. How does our situation today and this doubt that's being sown about our election process injure our reputation internationally as the gold standard of election processes?
I do worry about that a lot. We hold ourselves out as being, this grand democracy that people should strive for, and yet we're struggling as a country to figure out what are the things we value about this. So I am, as my friend Madeleine Albright says, an optimist who worries a lot, and that defines me too. I worry a lot about this election. I'm about the potential for political violence that I didn't think we'd ever have in this country, and that I've seen in lots and lots of other countries where I've observed elections. But I'm optimistic that the more we talk about this and have people understand what's at stake, and that it's beyond party, that Americans, as they have in the past, will rise to the occasion. For hundreds of years, we've been able to do peaceful transitions of power. We've been able to count all the votes that needed to be counted and have people accept that result. And I am optimistic that we will do that again as a country.
Robin Carnahan, thank you so much for joining us today, and Ed Larson, Jane Albrecht. Robin, how can people follow you if they want to keep in touch?
Oh, sure. I'm on Twitter at Robin Carnahan. So happy to hear from folks.
Carnahan.
That's it.
Until next week, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't have to hunt around to find Meet Me in the Middle next week. And thank you to our producer, A.J. Mosley. Music for Meet Me in the Middle is composed and performed by Celeste and Eric Dick. And the executive producer for this episode is Stuart Halpern. Tell your friends to vote. Vote early or vote in person. Don't wait until Election Day if you're mailing in your ballots. And don't freak out on Election Day. No one will know the actual outcome of this election on November 3rd. See you next week, everybody.
It will be okay.
From Kirko Media for your mind.